So by now you should have watched the Big Lebowski scene within the coffee room. And let's break that down a little bit and see how much Walter actually knows about the First Amendment versus what he's just kind of spouting off about. So the First Amendment says Congress shall make no law abridging the freedom of speech or of the press. And this applies to the states of the 14th Amendment for reasons at this point in time we don't need to talk about. But suffice it to say that all governments in the United States then are not allowed to abridge our freedom of speech or of the press as applied in later constitutional rulings. So what does this really mean? Does it mean that we can say whatever we want, whenever we want? Well, the reality is no, it can't. We have a right to say most of what we want when we want it, but there are some instances in which this is not the case. On the one hand, we've got political speech, which is almost always protected. So as long as we're talking about something that's related to politics, for example, criticizing an existing president, criticizing President Trump, criticizing, say, for example, Governor Wolf here in Pennsylvania, so that we'd have a Democrat and a Republican to criticize. That is allowable because it's part of our political speech. We always generally have the right when something's considered to be speech related to politics to speak that. Now, what's really interesting is under the First Amendment that not only speech, but symbolic speech is also protected. So for example, burning the flag is considered to be symbolic speech. And there's a case back in the late 80s where the Supreme Court basically said, look, we don't necessarily like the idea that you should be able to burn the flag, but the flag is the symbol of the United States. It's an emblem of what we are as a nation. And when somebody burns that, they're making a statement about what they think about the current state of the country. So while that is not actually verbalized speech, the very act of setting the flag on fire and letting it burn is what they would call symbolic speech. And that is protected under our First Amendment rights. Also, many of us grew up having to salute the flag in the morning, say the Pledge of Allegiance. The Supreme Court has said that you have a right not to speak in instances like this. So there were some Jehovah's Witnesses back in the 1930s who felt that this was an oath that violated their religious freedom. And the Supreme Court said that it was okay not to engage in that kind of speech. So we also have the right not to talk if we want to when it comes to political stuff. During the Vietnam War, some students wore black armbands to protest the Vietnam War, and that went up to the Supreme Court again. And the Supreme Court said, well, this is a way that the students are protesting. They're trying to say what they believe about the Vietnam War, that they oppose this. And wearing these black armbands with a peace symbol on it is really, again, this idea of symbolic speech. So in almost every circumstance, we are protected in what we say and what we do and related to politics. Just to give you an example of one case in which this didn't work out was people during the Vietnam War burnt their draft cards and said that this was symbolic speech. And the Supreme Court said, well, there's a reason why you have your draft card, and that is so that if you get drafted, you know where to go, and you use it as a form of identification. So in that instance, they said, no, it wasn't really symbolic speech. But for the most part, if you say something that is politically related, that is protected First Amendment speech. Some things that are not protected are offensive speech and obscenity. All right, so you can't. The classic is you can't yell fire in a crowded theater, right? So provocative language, as you see here, is okay as long as it does not present a quote clear and present danger of serious substantive evil that rises above public inconvenience, annoyance, or unrest. Right, so there are certain circumstances in which what you're going to do causes serious problems. As a consequence of that, your speech can be limited. Obscenity is something that's much more difficult to nail down. Basically, the Supreme Court has defined obscenity as being something that lacks artistic or scientific merit. It's difficult to really pose what that says. Usually the Federal Communications Commission is the one that determines that there's certain timing of when obscenity or nudity or that sort of thing can be on the radio or on television, although those have does vary between kind of broadcast stations and non-broadcast stations. So there are some restrictions on free speech. But what about our friend Walter, sitting in a coffee shop, being told that he can't use the F word and being asked to potentially leave if he doesn't quiet down? So the question is, can somebody that owns a private business regulate your free speech? And the question would be, could Walter have sued those people in the coffee shop? Well, the answer is no. In essence, the idea is that the First Amendment applies to the government so that the government cannot limit your speech. However, a private business owner can ask you to leave and they can regulate speech as they see fit. Now, there is a little bit of a caveat to that. So I cannot discriminate against people speaking on the basis of their race or nationality. So, for example, if I were to be a white owner of a restaurant, I could not ask somebody to leave because they're speaking just because they were an African American. That violates their civil rights, right? But if somebody happens to be sitting there spouting off about political views that I don't like as the owner, I can ask them to leave. It's my private business. And there's a separation there between the First Amendment as it applies to the government versus the First Amendment as it applies to businesses. So when we think about this, Walter is completely wrong. This is not a First Amendment issue in relationship to his being potentially kicked out of a coffee shop. But there is something else that he brings up, and that's the idea of prior restraint. And that leads us to this idea of freedom of the press. So in a democracy, it's very important that we have freedom of the press because they are the ones that really keep the government accountable. Most of us don't have the time or the ability to be able to investigate what the government does. The press is the one that does it. The press is the one that finds out the truth about what government may or may not be doing. And if we have censorship, basically the government has the ability to be able to control all the information within society, and people can't see how their government is operating, which then could obviously affect our liberties. So freedom of the press is one of the most important foundations of a free democratic society, and that's why it's so important. That's why we try to avoid government censoring things. So what about this concept of prior restraint that Walter's talking about? As we can take a look at our textbook, Barber and Wright, they define prior restraint as censorship of or punishment for the expression of ideas before the ideas are printed or spoken. In other words, prior restraint is government basically saying, hey, you can't print that. Basically stopping that really kind of censorship, right? Well, what does that mean in practice? Does the government have that right to stop people from printing something before they actually print it? And there's a case, Neer versus Minnesota, back in 1931, which naturally took place in Minnesota. And there's this guy, Neer, who published some anti-Semitic newspapers. And Minnesota basically said that, he was, this guy, Neer, was too anti-Semitic, making bad comments about public officials that happened to be Jewish, and they shut his newspaper down on the basis of what he was going to publish in the future. Well, the Supreme Court weighed in Neer versus Minnesota and said, you know what? No, government doesn't have the right to stop you from printing something before you actually print it, right? Because if that's the case, then the government could pretty much censor whatever they wanted. So the question becomes, well, suppose you're, somebody that, thinks something bad is going to be published about you. What recourse do you have to holding people accountable for what they publish? Really, you can't do anything before they publish something, but afterwards you can sue them for what's called libel. In other words, saying that somebody did something maliciously, knowing that it was wrong. Somebody said something about an individual that was blatantly false, then you could sue in civil court to get some kind of compensation for that. So it's a pretty high standard for libel, right? You actually have to show malice, actual false, something was actually false, and the people that published it didn't care whether it was false or not, right? And for public officials, it's darn near impossible for them to be able to prove that. As a private citizen, the bar is lower and easier to prove liable. But since public officials are expected to be in the limelight because they're public officials, for the most part, it's very difficult for them to prove liable. Now, there are some instances in which the Supreme Court has said that government might engage in prior restraint. And one of those things, a case New York Times versus the U.S., the Supreme Court said that there may be an instance in which there's national security information that might be published by a newspaper that might in some way, shape, or form put our troops at harm's way. I mean, think about D-Day in World War II. If say the Washington Post would have found out a couple of days in advance that we were going to invade France and they published that, that would be a national security issue. What we see in general is that the press, for the most part, will protect national security, and if they know secrets that might in some way hurt our troops in the future, they won't report that. Second thing is, we just talked about the idea of regulation of obscenity. You can stop that from happening. And also that we can prohibit something that would incite an act of violence, right? So there is some prior restraint, but for the most part, Walter had it completely wrong. He didn't have the right to shout the F word in a coffee shop under the First Amendment, because the First Amendment only applies to government and not to private entities. And second of all, he mentions the idea of prior restraint, and that wasn't prior restraint because he had already spoken those words. So a little constitutional lesson that we can learn via the Big Lebowski.